Hi, everybody. My name is Haley from ProWritingAid. Thank you so much for joining us for another session in the ProWritingAid series for writers. Today, we will be talking all about executive summaries with AJ. AJ has spent the last 10 years designing and teaching undergraduate and MBA level writing and communication courses. His primary research interests are writing development, knowledge transfer, and communication curriculum in higher education. So I will turn it over to you, AJ.
Thanks so much, Haley, and thanks everyone for being here today. Before I share my screen, the first thing I want to do is I want to ask everyone to answer a question in the chat. And that question is a pretty simple one, is yes or no, have you written or read an executive summary before? Just a pretty simple question. So if you wouldn't mind just answering in the chat, just so I can get a feel for people's experience with executive summary. Many, great. And so if you have, the next question I have for all of you is, if you have, what percentage of those executive summaries that you've either written or read, what percentage out of 100% would you say were memorable? What percentage of the executive summaries that you have written or read would you say are memorable? It's fascinating. We're getting some really good answers. Relatively low answers, as we can all see. Okay, I'll wait a little bit to see. Okay, maybe a third. We're getting lots. More or less, we're getting in the low 10 to 15%. Yeah. So the question I want to, the last question that I want to ask all of you is, if you put a low number for what percentage are memorable, does anyone, can you just offer up your own diagnosis in the chat? I'm just interested to hear, what do you, just get all of your insights a little bit before we begin. Like, what do you think it is? Like, why are so few of these executive summaries that we've either written or read, including myself, why are they not very memorable? Would you just offer up your own diagnosis in the chat? Okay, now we've got some sort of the dryness, not getting to enough information. Yeah, it's so hard to just for people to reduce information to its core key ideas. Yeah, these are really great analyses. Too long, right? And the executive summary is supposed to be short. Exactly. Too bland. Yeah. Okay. So thank you for your insights and for your feedback. Yeah, heart. I love it. I know. I love that idea of heart and emotion, maybe. Yeah, including our own. Right. Exactly. Me included. I'm including myself in writing dry executive summaries. So, all right, let's jump in. So today, what are we talking about? We're talking about how to write a compelling, effective executive summary. And here are my goals for today. One, I want you to leave with specific, actionable ideas and strategies. I literally want you to go, I have more tools for writing and specific tools for writing a great executive summary. The next one is I want to demystify it a little bit. I think it sounds, whenever we hear the term executive summary, we might have limited knowledge of it. And I just kind of want to demystify it a little bit and talk about what its real purpose is. And then I also want all of you to take away transferable knowledge. So what you learn about an executive summary today, there's some key principles that I think you can apply to all kinds of business writing and even personal writing as well. So the key ideas that we're going to learn about today are not just things that apply to the executive summary, but they apply to all kinds of documents that we might write, including emails, any kinds of reports, RFPs, even presentations. So I think it's only fair, right, that if I'm talking about what a good executive summary is, I need to have a good one. So here's the thing, 3 things for a great executive summary. It needs to be an engaging story in less than 1 page. It cannot be more than 1 page, right? An engaging story. It must guide your reader to action and understanding. We almost want to think about an executive summary as an instruction manual. Here's Here's how to do this. Here's what I want you to do. This is what we're kind of telling our reader to do with an executive summary. And then lastly, it must be reader-centric. It must be tailored to the person who is going to read this. And then it also must be conversational. You know, someone mentioned heart and someone mentioned bland and dry. And we really want this to feel like a discussion with someone, an engaging conversation. All right, so we've got this problem. I want to talk about some problems. We are all really busy these days, right? We are all really busy. So we're reading and writing all day. I want to give you some stats. On average, and according to a McKinsey analysis, we receive about 120 emails a day. 1/3 of our workday is reading and writing emails. And since 1980, we work 4 more weeks annually, and we work a longer work week. So what this comes out to is that as compared to 1980, we work about 1 month more every year than other people. Than people in 1980. So what does this mean? Well, it means we have cognitive overload. We are totally overwhelmed with work, with information, with data, with things that people want from us, with things that we need from other people. And so what is cognitive overload? Cognitive overload happens when your brain shuts down because it's forced to engage and handle too many kinds of stimulus. So I want to give you an example. It's kind of meta right now. Imagine you're on a Zoom call, which this isn't a crazy hypothetical for many of you right now. You're on a Zoom call, you're listening or you're talking, and then someone on that Zoom chats something to you, right? Sends you a private chat, and it's a question. So now you're kind of like, all right, I'm on the Zoom call. Now I have a chat. Cognitively, I'm split. And then let's say you're looking at your email too while you're on the email. Now an email pops up from someone that's urgent. And at a certain point, you just go, I don't even know where to begin. I'm overwhelmed. But your cognitive focus is totally split. And it's not on the one thing that you're trying to do or the two things that you're trying to do. And what happens is you just get overwhelmed and you don't do any of these things very well. And I don't think what I'm describing is a completely unknown phenomenon to many of you. And I know I experience it as a teacher and as a researcher and consultant all the time. And what this leads to is just information anxiety and information exhaustion. So I think there's a solution to this problem, and it's what I call TLDR culture. And TLDR, as most of you probably know, is too long, didn't read. And so I think what we're doing is we're slowly moving into a culture that kind of thinks about like, you know, hey, people don't have a lot of time. And people aren't going to read things, or they're not going to process things if it's too long, or if it's too dry, if it's too boring. So I think in a way that we've got this emerging, what I call TLDR culture, that's going to kind of help us out. Let me give you some examples. So Harvard Business Review is aware of TLDR culture. And so in the June issue of their magazine, but they do this in every one of their issues, is they'll have a main article, or they'll have lots of articles. And in each of these articles, they have this great section that's called Idea in Brief. And so again, they'll have like a 4-page spread, but then an inset on one of the pages, they'll say idea in brief. And who is this for? This is for us, right? This is for the busy people. And interestingly, I think this idea in brief is exactly like a great executive summary, right? Because there's two things that happen. I read Harvard Business Review, and when I read an idea in brief, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, just like a good executive summary, I can make two choices. The first is I can just read the idea in brief, and I don't read the article, and I've saved time, but I've learned something, right? So that's one thing that can happen. And by the way, I'm seeing some people saying, oh, I'm totally overloaded. And yeah, great. I think we don't recognize cognitive overload enough. I mean, this is a real phenomenon, and we need to recognize ways to fix it. So this Harvard Business Review approach is one. And so the idea in brief, when we get back to it, it does two things. One, I can say, all right, great, I'm not going to read the article because the idea in brief gave me that insight that I needed. The second thing that it can do is it can make me go, I like this stuff. Now I know why this article, what it's about, and why I should keep reading. And what I love too is look at this really simple breakdown that they've done in the idea in brief. We've got the problem, we've got why it happens, and we've got the solution. So not only is this idea in brief helping us process the entire article and process our busy lives. But it's also saying, wait, let me not just give you a boring summary. Let me not just give you like 5 bullet points about what the article's about. Let me create what I would call a mini narrative, a mini story. So we've got the problem, why this problem happens, and a solution to the problem, which is a really tight story if you think about it. So this is one way where people are addressing TLDR culture. Another way is that there's a big move to conversational writing and communication. And when we interact with people or when we read something, and when that communication is in a conversational format, like when it just sounds like people are talking to us, it's easier for us to negotiate cognitively because our brains aren't going, what does that phrase mean? I don't understand what revenue sharing is, or I don't understand what synergy is, or a symbiotic, or these kinds of businessy terms. So the one illustration of someone, of a group of people trying to help with TLDR culture is this book by called Weekend Language. And I'm going to reduce their central premise. It's an amazing book, and you should totally check it out if you're interested. And I reduced their entire book to these 3 things. When we're hanging out friends up on the weekend, we're great storytellers, right? We're not saying, well, I need to leverage this and I need to, cross-reference and triangulate these 3 data streams, right? We're just telling great stories with our friends. And during the week, we're boring, PowerPoint-driven robot communicators, and we're using technical language, we're using jargon. We're not writing or communicating in a compelling way. So these authors of Weekend Language say, let's start telling compelling stories, right? Just like we do on the weekends. And let's bring that weekend language into the workplace. So these are just 2 examples of what I believe are TLDR cultures, people realizing that everybody's overwhelmed, but we can take steps to make that better. And I want you to be thinking about that TLDR culture as we talk about how to write a great effective summary, because it really permeates our entire ways that I want you to be thinking about the executive summary. So what is an executive summary? It's a short 1-page story of a longer business document's contents. It's used in legal briefs, product descriptions, market research reports, and it's used across industries. So why do we write an executive summary? We really need to think about, like, what is the purpose? Why does it exist? So one reason is you need to sell your document with a sales pitch. And if you don't have an executive summary, there's lots of negative things that will happen, but could happen. But one classic thing is that people will not read an 80-page document if you do not offer a sales pitch, if you do not sell them on why they should read this document, why it's valuable. So the executive summary is not a summary, it's really a sales pitch. And it's an opportunity to do what Josh Bernoff, he's a famous writing theorist and consultant, he says you need to highlight the sexy stuff, the interesting stuff, the engaging insights, right? And the other thing, the other reason why you need to write an executive summary is you want to guide the reader. You literally want to imagine choreographing their actions. So, you can imagine someone reading your executive summary, and as you walk them through the logic of the executive summary, you're setting them up. And there's 2 things that you're setting them up for. Are you setting them up to make a decision right away based off of what's in the, we need to buy this product. We need to buy this consulting firm's additional services. We need to move forward with this new HR plan, right? What action are you guiding them towards? That's what the executive summary needs to lead to. Or are you leading them to read the entire doc? Are you reading them to say, you know what, I want more information. I like what I'm hearing here. And now I know I want to know more. Before I make that decision or before I fully get it, I want to read the entire document. Okay. So there's 2 principles for an effective executive summary. The first is, and this is a transferable knowledge like I was talking about before, right? So let me go back here. So there's 2 principles for an effective executive summary. The first is, and this again applies to all, is you must begin with the reader. right? So who is reading this and why are they reading this? This is that empathy-driven writing. I need to figure out, is this a client? Is this a manager at the company that I'm working for? And the other thing that we rarely think about with writing and communication is what kinds of power dynamics are at play, meaning who's the lever puller? Who's the decision maker? And what do they care about? What do they already know? And how do I organize this information so that this person can act, you know? And what are the various factors at play in whether they act? Is it money? Is it how urgent this issue is, right? So these are just a set of questions that you have to ask yourself before you write an effective executive summary, that you really need to spend time in the reader's shoes. You really need to figure out their worldview. You know, and this is transferable to everything that we do in business communication, is that we're constantly trying to step outside ourselves and be reader-centric. And the second thing that it needs to do, so we start with the reader, is that we need to tell an engaging story. And I think we hear this all the time in the business world, right? Like storytelling, it's almost become a cliche. I think Microsoft has a chief storytelling officer right now. And so one of the funny things about cliches, and if you use ProWritingAid, you'll know that you can look for cliches, because we don't want cliches in our writing. But I remember a grad school professor asking my class, what is it about cliches? Why do they persist? Why do they endure? And the truth is that cliches endure because they're often true, right? And so when you hear all of this idea about tell stories, it really makes sense. But I think what we rarely do is explain to people, what do we mean by story in the business context? And what I really mean about a story in a business context is not telling some sort of like, you know, Titanic story or, you know, some sort of goofy, you know, sitcom story, but more just, you know, what kinds of problems and solutions are people negotiating in their lives and in the workplace? And if you organize a story around like a backstory and main characters, a problem and a solution, that's going to be compelling, right? That even if the content of your document is super dry and it might not seem interesting to anybody, if you organize it in terms of a problem and a solution and people working through these problems and solutions, you're going to create a story, right? And if you think about it in that way, you're going to tell something that's more memorable, something that's more easily retold. Okay, so a big idea to keep in mind from Josh Burnoff, who I referenced earlier, is this. Every document has sexy stuff, cool conclusions, fascinating statistics, illuminating metaphors, and incisive examples. And this is the stuff that we want as part of our story, right? That we don't want to just repeat, you know, this sort of dry overview, but really we can provide these fascinating statistics, these cool conclusions, incisive examples, the sexy stuff as part of a story with people, with characters who have problems and are looking for solutions. So I want to give you a really simple 3-step template for a great executive summary. And it's super simple. And despite the fact that it might seem so simple, what I want to emphasize is that this template is effective in 2 ways. One, it helps you organize your thinking. And I think a lot of us might have written an 80-page document or a 40-page document, and we go, I don't even know where to begin to break this thing down. I don't even know where to, there's so much going on here, right? But if I force you into 3 areas, what is the problem that, how did this document arise? It arose from a problem. So what problem is it addressing? How does it provide a solution? And what's the benefit of that solution? Karen Duarte is a famous communication expert, and what she always talks about is basically a good business story is what is and what could be. And this is what we need to do whenever we're communicating with people, right? And what we often all do is we focus on what is. And the what is in this template is the problem and the solution, but the benefit is what could be. And so what you want to do is you want to give people an understanding of here's what's currently going on and here's what things could look like. And that's the benefit part. So three areas. And I have an example, a hypothetical example, and this is a lot of text, and I'm going to reduce it for all of you. And this is in the blog post that's associated with this webinar. And so I'm just going to reduce how I talked about the problem. Is basically, and this is a hypothetical example, we've got this company, Iconics, and they have this problem. And I've came up with this problem, from the real world, from people that I interview at businesses. They say this: no one reads our internal communication. No one's reading what we're up to, what we're working on, any big successes. And what it feels like is people are disconnected. And we can't have that. We have one team over here that's working on something, and we have another team over here that's working on something, and neither of these teams know what the other is doing. And this is a problem. This is, again, this is a problem. And so Iconics has this kind of communication, knowledge, culture problem. They come to a consulting firm and they say, help us with this. And then this is the executive summary of a report that the consulting firm has created for Iconics. And here in the first paragraph, they provide the backstory. Here's what's going on. Here's what you all came to us with. Here's the problem. And here's our diagnosis of the problem. We have there's two key problems within that larger problem. And here's where in an executive summary, you can get very specific, even though we don't think we should be, is I've got this great quote from a team member who says this: I don't read the emails because they're usually too long or just not relevant to anything that I'm doing. This quote illustrates the larger problem that I'm trying to convey to Iconics. And then the second thing is, the second point that I make is, we've got another statistic. Only 7% said they felt that it was important to know what other teams were doing. And here's a quote: I don't see how knowing that marketing is rolling out a new social media campaign helps me in any way. And if you're an executive at Iconics and you hear these quotes, you go, oh boy, these are my people speaking. This is interesting. This is, in my view, this is sexy, right? This is provocative. I'm actually hearing the words of people saying, I'm not reading anything. So now let's go to the solution. And what I do in the solution is a lot of signposting too. And what I mean by signposting is I say, I've got 3 things, right? And in the problem, I said, I've got 2 things. And signposting, by saying to people, I'm going to talk to you about three things, I'm organizing information for them. And this is another reader-centric way of doing things. So here I come up with 3 solutions. And they're not very long, and they're quick and direct and to the point. And then what I do in the next slide, in the next thing, is I say, here are the benefits. And I actually, I frame it as a benefit. I frame it as what could be, right? So I've got the what is and the problem and the solution, and then I've got the what could be. And the what could be is this: what would Iconics look like if they implemented these solutions? And here I come up with it, right? If they implement these solutions, it could drive revenue and it'll increase overall team member satisfaction. And this is the story of the document. And all the specifics will be in the longer document, right? But this is going to give the executive at Iconics who has this problem, they're going to hear me, the consultant, saying back to them, here's what I think your problem is. Here's what I think is going on with that problem. Here's how we fix it. And here's what would happen if you fix it. They now have 2 choices. They could just say, all right, let's implement it. Let's take your solutions. Let's run with it. Or they'll say, I want the details on this. I want to read more. And then I'll make a decision. But what you've done is you've given them a taste of what the rest of that document is going to look like. And if you write this in a compelling and engaging way, they're going to say, well, I'm going to presume that the rest of this document is engaging, compelling, and direct and reader-centric. So this is what a great executive summary does. Now, I want to point out something. I think all of us daily are going, how do I boil lots of information down? I have so many things I want to say, but I don't know how to reduce it. This Harvard Business Review article is 4,000 words, and they reduced it to me, this looks to be about maybe 200 words. So I want to give you all some tips for reducing big documents or big ideas or even stuff in your head. I want to give you some tips for reducing that down. And this is a great example of how that's done. So I want you to think about the story idea. And I want you to think about whatever you're writing about. And I want you to find the main characters. Think about it as a movie or a story. And you are going to start every one of your sentences with the main characters. You just start writing, right? So if I'm writing, if I'm a professor at USC, if someone would in my department say, hey, we want a review of your semester and the teaching, what happened this semester? And I'll go, oh, how do I begin to talk about this semester? I've got over 100 students. I taught 5 different classes. Where do I begin? Well, who are the main characters? My students and me. And then the other thing I could say is the syllabus or the course, right? So I'll start off, overall, my students found this semester to be challenging, right? That might be a way that I start. And the other thing that you want to think about is what are the problems and solutions for that problem? And I know we might not often think about anything, like we can't think about everything in terms of problem solution. So another way to think about it is what and so what, right? So if you can't reduce whatever your document is to a problem and solution, you can reduce it to what? What are we talking about? And so what? Why are we talking about this? And so I'll repeat it. You find the main characters of your movie, you find the problem and solution that's happening, and then you take those main characters and you put them into the problem and solution. How are they involved in the problem and solution? And what I know is you're far more likely to get to a good analysis, to a good synthesis, to a good compelling story of a big document if you start with people or big ideas, and then problem and solution, because you're going to interweave, you're going to link these people, problems, and solutions in a way where if you were to just go, oh, how do I reduce this document about revenue sharing and projected results for 2021, instead start with people, and it's going to make for a more compelling read. And it also is going to lead to more action, because if you put people in, then people see the people who are involved and their stake, and they'll know how they're related to the things that you're talking about. So let's see, does my idea of does my 3-step process for boiling information down, how does it play out in this Harvard Business Review article? And again, it's all about who, what, and so what. So let's go back to that article. If you look at these sentences, you'll see for the problem, it starts off with the major player, large public corporations, right? And then in the why it happens, the next one is managers at large corporations. So again, they're starting off with a more specific character at these large corporations. And then for the solution, what word do they start with? Managers. Right? So we have the same actor. If this is a 3-part act of a story, we've got the same actor in every scene. And we're anchoring our description in that actor's behavior, right? So the verb for the problem is they frequently offload business units, right? And that's telling us what's going on, what that actor is doing. And then in the why it happens, we have managers at large corporations are wedded, right? So we have them doing this action. And now we have the same people who have the problem have the solution. Managers should. And this is how we give people guidance on how to act and how to respond to the things that we want them to do. And this is how we change giving people information and giving people knowledge that they can act on. This is the difference maker in good writing, is that we organize information for people in ways that they can act. Okay, so my recap. You need to tell an engaging story in less than 1 page, right? It cannot go over 1 page. I don't think anyone will read anything over 1 page. It holds for resumes, and I think and cover letters, and it holds for, the TLDR culture that we live in these days. it must guide the reader to action and understanding. It must provoke them. It must make them say, yep, I want to move on this, or now, now I totally get this. And then it must be reader-centric. It must come out of their world. It must be organized around their problems, their concerns, the stake that they have in this topic. And it must be conversational. And if you look at the blog post that I did for the Iconics hypothetical example, you'll see that none of the writing is difficult. None of the writing is above a particular grade level. And this is why ProWritingAid can be so helpful, is that you can write it in ProWritingAid and it will give you readability analysis. It'll tell you whether or not, that text that you've written is above a certain grade level. And ultimately, these three things come together for a great executive summary, but not only a great executive summary, but all the kinds of writing that we do. Right? Even emails, you can use the problem solution benefit template for emails and for all kinds of things. So I want to stop there, and I know we have a bunch of questions, and I'm super interested. I know that some of you have been giving me some good feedback, and I have been kind of saying some things in the chat. So I am really intrigued. I'm particularly interested in people who disagree with me, right? Or say, hey, we can't do that. AJ, like if you have a problem with it, not necessarily a problem, but anything where you're like, how would you do that? I'm super intrigued to hear those, but I'm also intrigued to hear anyone who has their own examples or their own approach to really compelling and engaging executive summaries. So why don't we jump into the Q&A?
Awesome. All right. So first up, Ingrid asks, do you recommend doing more than one executive summary based on audience? If so, could you share what that might look like?
I really like this idea. And I think that, so here's my assumption. You might be able to create one executive summary for a client, and then you could create an executive summary that's internal for your own team. Right. So let's say I have a manager who's put me on a project for the client Iconics. And I produced this 80-page report, lots of findings, the methodologies, lots of charts, lots of graphs, lots of data. Well, I have a feeling my client is living in TLDR culture, so I'm going to write an executive summary for them. And then I think it could be cool to write an executive summary for your manager who also is living in the TLDR culture, doesn't have time to read the 80-page document, but says, hey, AJ, I'm getting on an airplane. Can you give me a one-page overview of that explains to me the value that you think you're creating for the client with this document that you've produced. So I recently heard this metaphor of the airplane mode, which is a student of mine had an internship, and the bosses there would say, you need to put all of your documents in airplane mode, which means that if I go onto an airplane and I don't have Wi-Fi and I don't have anything, I can still fully understand everything that's going on in this document without having to click on any links, without having to look anything up. So I think this is a way of thinking about a great executive summary too, is putting it in airplane mode so that anybody can read it and get it and process it.
Awesome. Okay, a couple questions from Jacqueline. So first, do you recommend having the problem, solution, and benefit all in separate slides for presentations?
I do. I do. I'm actually a big fan in terms of presentations. It's a great question. In terms of presentations, I'm a huge fan of more slides and fewer text. I hope I followed that rule with my own presentation, right? But I'm a fan of more slides and fewer texts and less text on each slide. And often, I think the other thing about this question that I think is really so cool is that when we come up with the problem, we need to be really thorough. And I teach a consulting class to MBA students, and one of the things that we focus on so much is that we must really articulate the problem that we're presenting to people really well, because everything flows from there, right? Like everything flows. So how we diagnose a problem and how we articulate what a problem is, that will determine what our solution is. And so if you come up with a solution that's not aligned to a problem, people are going to get lost and things will not happen. And so I think, to get to your point, having more slides for the problem I'd err on the side of having more slides for the problem than fewer, because you really want to make sure that you've articulated the problem so that when you present the solution, people see how they're linked and how they're aligned. This is a classic kind of logic consulting thing that you really need to make sure your problem is fully articulated. And so I'd argue, articulate that problem in a presentation in more slides than fewer, so that you're not just writing like 12 bullet points on one slide.
So a follow-up question on problems. Ingrid asks, what if there are multiple problems being solved? Do you try to wrap the summary around those or focus on the main one, or do you have any strategies for embracing additional facets?
Great question. So there's a famous McKinsey way of thinking about communication, and it's the pyramid principle. And basically the pyramid principle, if you think about a pyramid shape, you have this big idea at the top and then everything flows underneath it. So what I would suggest is, let's say what you're writing on has 2 or 3 different problems. I would argue you should try to organize those 3 under one larger theme. Right, under one larger theme. So for example, the iconics example that I gave, I think you could organize, if that had multiple problems, I think you could organize it under the theme of communication shapes culture and culture shapes communication. So that could be a big theme. And then underneath it, you could link those problems to the larger theme. The reason I say this, and the reason I bring up the McKinsey pyramid principle, is that when people like things to be linked and related and organized together. And if you have distinct problems, people will often be less able to remember those problems if they're not linked. So you want to create relationships between the problems that you're addressing so that people just understand the more holistic view. So I would say, rather than have 3 separate problems that you kind of just throw out there, I would kind of create this larger thematic idea. And it doesn't necessarily need to be a problem, but it's like this larger thematic, big idea. And then underneath it, link those 3 problems together and then link them to the theme.
Right. So someone says, how do you see executive summary and abstracts? Are they similar or different?
I think that's a great question. And this is where things get slippery, because we're often talking about different communities or different kinds of industries or fields. So when I say communities, I mean academia is a community. And an abstract when I wrote the abstract for my dissertation, it was far different than an executive summary in a business setting. And the abstract for my dissertation does not need to be a sexy, and this is in the community of academia, because academia, the people who are reading my dissertation bring different expectations to that abstract than, say, clients who are reading the executive summary of your report. And so what you want to think about for an abstract let's say in an academic community, is that it just needs to be a relatively concise summary overview of your dissertation. So I think this is a cool question. And I think what you often have to do with these kinds of things is you really have to define key terms. So whatever organization you're writing in, if they say we need an abstract, you'll have to do some work to go, well, what does an abstract look like? What do you all, and because I think in some cases people might think that abstracts and executive summaries are interchangeable terms. I'd also say too that maybe if you're asked to write an abstract in a business setting, given that we're in TLDR culture, I would still say the same principles apply to the abstract. Like, no matter what, in a business setting, people don't want to read things that are boring, dry, unrelated, not narrative driven. So yeah.
Awesome. So someone asked, how do you guide your readers to action without seeming too salesy?
That's a great question. I think your ability to persuade someone rests on your ability to understand them and to craft the problem in terms and in urgency and in stakes that are that are their stakes and urgency and problem. So I did a recent consulting. I did something recently for some consulting. I did some training, and at the end, I offered the client an overview or a kind of an analysis of what I found, and I offered them some steps moving forward. And this was the problem. I'm not a salesy type person. And so, but I did think that there were some solutions that would be really helpful for them, but I didn't want the client to feel that I was selling her on those solutions. And so what I tried to do is, rather than say, sell them, I just crafted a problem that really mapped onto her concerns of good communication, of polished prose. And at the end of the day, as long as you're trying to craft the problem around them and craft a really good solution that addresses their problem and paints the picture of what could be, right? So for this client, I could say, if you use a tool like ProWritingAid, here's what daily communication could look like. Beyond that, everyone has their own sweet spot with sales and what they feel comfortable with. But I would argue beyond that, your sales, it could feel too salesy. I feel like if you don't move them with the quality of your ideas, then maybe beyond that is sales and not engagement and understanding and providing people with real value.
Right. So someone says, can you recommend a presentation format or software? Do you use PowerPoint or newer stuff like Prezi?
So my advice first is there's a company called Duarte, Duarte, and I can put that in the chat. And they are, I would argue, the world's greatest communications firm, and they are constantly trying to help people for free on how to do great presentations. It's as if they think it's almost like a philanthropic thing. They realize that there are people out there every day listening to the most boring, dry presentations ever. And they're like, we want to help humanity. And so Duarte has several great resources for this. I think that in their advice, their concern, and I think this makes sense, is their advice, which I take too, is you really need to craft a story be outside of your PowerPoint, outside of Canva, outside of it. Like, you might want to storyboard first before you even get to PowerPoint, because what happens in PowerPoint and what can happen in other tools is that you're limited to the resources that PowerPoint has. And what you want to do is think beyond the box of PowerPoint and think, if I could just draw this entire presentation as a series of storyboards, it's going to be far more creative. You're going to think more creatively. You're going to come up with more and more better ideas. So my advice is to really, just on a piece of paper, or even on a brainstorming wall, or a flip chart or something, Flipboard, is just throwing out lots of ideas and thinking about the kind of story that you want to tell. And I really think they're related, but there are two things. Think about things. I think it's just really helpful for me to think about things in terms of problem, solution, benefit. And Duarte will talk about what is and what could be, right? And so that's another way of thinking about a 30,000 foot structure, is like, all right, my presentation, here's how I can lay it out. I'm going to start with, here's how things are right now. And part of that could be, here's the problem with how things are. And then here's how things could be. So that's my advice in terms of presentations. Yeah.
All right. And then the last it's not really a question, but Timothy says that the problem, solution, benefit model is a great way to outline the entire document. So you can kind of start with that and then move forward.
Timothy brings up a really thoughtful point too, is that some people suggest writing the executive summary first. And what can happen in a long document, I'm sure as any of us have experienced, and as I did with my dissertation, how does page 288 of my dissertation relate to page 9? because it has to, but it can't, it's not like directly linked, right? And the only way that those 300 pages or all the documents that all of you are writing are linked across multiple documents is because of a thoughtful, logical outline. And I think you're totally right. And this is why problem solution benefit, you know, that if you, and also what it does is it's a cognitive thing. It chunks up your thinking. So when you're in the problem section, you don't need to be worried about the solution, right? Because you're just focusing on the problem section. And then when you're in the solution section, you're just focusing on the solution. And obviously it's going to be related to the problem. But often I think what we do is we go, oh, I need to talk about this, and then I need to talk about that. And chunking it up into problem solution benefit, what it can do is help us focus, be like, all right, on this part, I'm just going to be talking about the problem. And, you know, I'm not going to be worried about the solution yet. It's a thoughtful observation.
Awesome. All right. Well, I think those were, oh, here, one more came in. So somebody asked, do you use picture and video with executive summaries?
I think no, and here's why. Although, because I'm such a proponent of TL, like, you know, of writing less and saying more, in an executive summary, if you think you can include a visual, that does a ton of work, right? It does a lot of work. I'm not talking about a chart necessarily. I don't think that would be great because it's just gonna speak to one part. But if there's some sort of visual that you think would make the client, like maybe it's like a evidence of something, that could be really cool and compelling and interesting. And you know, the cliche again, a picture is worth 1,000 words, that if you do have a visual of something that you think the client really needs to see, and that perhaps offers multiple ways of thinking of, like, powerful, like persuasive ways of, like, oh my gosh, look at this photo, you know, that could almost become viral, that the client would be like, well, share with their coworkers and say, we've got to do this, look at this photo, that would be a cool idea. But otherwise, I think the words should do the work, and there should be lots of white space, and this is why one page is really key. But yeah, I would keep video or you know, visuals out of the executive summary generally. Yeah.
All right, then Jacqueline, Jacqueline asked what are our names. So I'll put them in the chat, Jacqueline, so that you can have our full names. I think those were I think those were all of the questions. Were there any others that anyone had? All right, awesome. Well, thank you guys so much. Thank you, AJ. That was so informative and interesting as always. Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.
Take care.
Bye.